to you.
Yes. So I see our next presenter is already online, and allow me to say a few words about who she is. We are rejoining the central theme of the two-day conference, particularly the branch of that program, uh, artificial intelligence. And we've talked on and off over the last day and a half about governance. And we know that there is a new governance structure for AI that has been propounded by the new president. And so, in order to address the issue of country level governance, comparing three different large countries, we have the pleasure of having a colleague uh, in Washington, D.C., Anshu Saxena Arora, who is a full professor of marketing and social robotics at the School of Business and Public Administration at the University of the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. She's also founding director of artificial intelligence, social robotics, a laboratory at UDC, University of the District of Columbia, funded by the National Science Foundation, numerous publications in the field of AI and social robotics. And she's going to talk to us about the evolving governance, AI governance structure across the United States, the European Union, and China, using a paper in which actually I'm a co-author and which she presented in Paris, France, last November at our China Goes Global conference in late November. So it's a pleasure to greet you and to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. McIntyre. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be, on a call with Dr. McIntyre and making a presentation for this group. So thank you for having me. Thank you. Let me quickly share my screen here. Can you all see my screen at the moment?
Yes, perfect.
Right. Perfect. Well, once again, a very, very good afternoon, everyone. The topic or the title that I'll be presenting today is Developing Global Artificial Intelligence Governance or Regulation Framework Impacting the United States, China, and the European Union. As Dr. McIntyre has already introduced me, I'm Dr. Anshurura. I'm a professor of marketing and robotics and the director for artificial intelligence, social robotics, and behavioral research lab that we have at the School of Business and Public Administration in the University of the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. Now, as a part of the lab, you can see on the right, I have some robots here. So I work very closely with these robots, the Now robots and the Pepper robot. And these robots are actually used for working with the DC public school system in Washington, DC, especially with high schoolers who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So that's what we do as a part of the lab that we have at UDC. With me, my co-authors on this research are Dr. Amit Arora. He's a professor of supply chain management at UDC. Dr. John R. McIntyre, of course, the professor of management, cyber director at Scheller College of Business, Georgia Tech. And Dr. K. Siva Kumar, who is a professor and chair of marketing at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. And just a few words about UDC. So University of the District of Columbia, or UDC, happens to be the only urban land-grant public university in the nation's capital. And we also happen to be an HBCU, which is historically Black College University. With that said, the research that I'm about to present today has been supported and funded by several grants from the National Science Foundation and also from Cyber of Georgia Tech. So again, I'm very thankful to be here. And thanks, Dr. McIntyre, for having me here. All right, with that, let's get started. So let's talk about the entire AI landscape, the AI policy, AI regulation landscape. And let's talk about China, China's AI policy. China always has been a proactive actor in the field of designing and developing AI laws and regulations. So as you can see here, we have a timeline for the China's AI policy regulation landscape. This started in 2017 when China came up with the next generation AI development plan, or AIDP, that became very, very popular. And then, of course, they came up with the cybersecurity law in 2017. Then they came up with next generation AI governance principles, and then followed by data security law in 2021, the next generation AI code of ethics in 2021. They have a personal information protection law in 2021, management measures measures for Internet Information Service algorithmic recommendations in 2022, the management measures for Internet Information Service deep synthesis in 2023, and the interim measures for management of generative AI services in 2023. So as you can see here, China, as I said earlier, is a very proactive actor in the field of AI, designing AI laws and regulations. In 2021, China actually came up or actually promulgated a set of rules and regulations for regulating, the recommendations, the algorithmic recommendations or the recommendation algorithms. And then a year later, they came up with a set of rules and regulations for regulating deepfakes. And believe it or not, within 6 months of ChatGPT being born, China was the first country in the world within 6 months to come up with the law or the draft measures for generative AI services. So that was a big deal from China's perspective. China's Internet Watchdog, the CAC, or the Cyberspace Administration of China, along with the 6 other PRC authorities, issued the highly anticipated interim measures on the management of generative AI services, which took effect on August 15, 2023. And while the entire world was talking about the European Union and the EU AI Act, China was the first country in the world to impose the licensing regime for AI services. So that was a lot of deal that was happening from China. And again, believe it or not, within 2 months of ChatGPT being born in the US, China was the first country to actually started requesting Apple and many other global companies like Apple to remove about 100 ChatGPT-like apps from the Apple Store as tighter regulations set to take effect in China. So that is a broader sort of a timeline for China's AI regulation. Now let's talk about the European Union, the 2024 EU AI Act. Again, let's look at the timeline for the EU AI Act here. So in 2019, there were initial discussions on AI regulation that began within the EU. In 2020, the European Commission published a white paper on AI outlining key proposals and soliciting stakeholder feedback. In 2021, the EU AI Act was formally proposed. And then in 2022, the European Parliament and Council engaged in negotiations to refine the Act, addressing concerns from various stakeholders. In 2023, the final amendments were made and was approved by the European Parliament. And finally, the EU AI Act came into existence on March 13, 2024, when the European Parliament approved the EU AI Act, which was enforced on August 1, 2024, and this act is applicable in 27 European Union member states covering all of the AI systems impacting people in the EU, regardless of where the systems are developed or deployed. The act does not replace, but overlap with the protections offered by GDPR or the General Data Protection Regulation, although the former scope is more expansive and not restricted to personal data. So while GDPR or the General Data Protection Regulation Act of the European Union is all about data privacy, data protection, our EU AI Act from the European Union is more about talking about the consumers, consumer fairness, consumer privacy, consumer data rights protection, along with impacting businesses and the governments. So that is the EU AI Act of 2024. To put it more broadly and to understand this act a little more broadly, we have to talk about the levels of risk which are offered as a part of the EU AI Act. So here we have Level 1, which is a minimal risk, which is more to do with the AI-based spam filters and video games. Then we have Level 2 risk, which is a limited risk again. And this is where the transparency is very important. This is where the chatbots, the AI-enabled deepfakes, emotion recognition systems fall into this category. And again, ChatGPT or the generative AI services also fall in this particular category. So this is a limited risk. And the important thing here is the transparency, where while the human is interacting with the machine, the human needs to know that he or she is interacting with the machine and not a real human. So that's where the transparency is very, very important. Then we move on to level 3. So the level 3 risk here are high risk. This is where we have the AI-enabled health or education or employment, justice, immigration, law, safety. Those are the things that are more important in the high risk. And here a human oversight is needed under the level 3 risk or the high risk, and also the high risk conformity assessment is required. And then we have the level 4 risk, which is the unacceptable or prohibited risk. In this risk, we are talking about the AI-enabled social scoring of humans, which is completely prohibited. The facial recognition of biometrics, the dark pattern AI, and the manipulation, all of this is restricted, prohibited, and unacceptable under the EU AI Act. So just to give an example of the social scoring thing that we're talking about here, this is very similar to what we have in China, where we have a China social credit system. And for those of you who know, the way this particular social credit system works in China is that we have, the governments are scoring the citizens for maybe paying their debts on time, so they get a positive score for that. If they miss their payments, then they get a negative score. If you're doing a jaywalking on the streets, you get a negative score. And if you're paying again, your things on time, or you're contributing to charity, you get a positive score. And overall, the cumulative scores will determine for the citizens as to where their kids go to school to, or whether they are able to travel, or whether they are able to qualify for getting a loan or not. So that is all a part of the social credit system that we have in China. But if that is using the AI or the AI-enabled social scoring, then according to the EU AI Act, that's completely prohibited and unacceptable. So that's what we have as the EU AI Act timeline here. Now let's talk about the United States AI Executive Order, or the AI regulation in the US. So here it started in 2016. The Partnership on AI was established, fostering dialogue and ethical AI practices among tech companies and nonprofits. In 2018, the American AI Initiative was born. In 2019, the Algorithmic Accountability Act was introduced, aiming to hold companies accountable for biases in automated decision making. In 2022, the Biden administration released the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. In 2023, the increased state level interest led to at least 25 states considering legislation to regulate AI technologies. And then finally, again, in 2024-25, we are still carrying on with discussions focusing on refining AI governance. And to talk about it in a more detailed way, on October 30th, 2023, the President Biden at that time came up with the executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence. As a part of this order, we have the 8 guiding AI principles, which is AI must be safe, secure. It must be promoting responsible innovation, competition, collaboration. It must result in equity, civil rights, protecting interests of users, privacy and civil liberties must be protected, management of risk with regulation and governance, and promoting innovation and competition with effective leadership. So that was a part of the executive order from President Biden in 2023. Now, as of recent times, on January 23rd, 2025, President Trump came up with this executive order. And according to the Trump administration, the United States has long been at the forefront of AI innovation, driven by the strength of our free markets and entrepreneurial spirit. To maintain this leadership, we must develop AI systems that are free from ideological bias or engineered social agendas. And hence, Biden's policies act as barriers to American AI innovation, clearing a path for the United States to act decisively to retain global leadership in artificial intelligence. So as of now, we don't have any federal regulation in the field of AI. So as per the executive order, and as you can see here under Section 4, it says, within 180 days of this order, the Assistant to President for Science and Technology, along with other federal bodies, will come up and develop and submit to the President an action plan to achieve the policy set forth in the Section 2 of this order. So again, we are talking about removing barriers to American leadership in artificial intelligence. That's the executive order as of January 23rd, 2025. But this means really that there is no federal regulation in the United States when it comes to AI policy or AI regulation in the US. All right, now let's move forward. So here, what I want to show you here is basically a sort of an analytical framework that we can use to analyze these various AI policies, which are there across China, the US, and the European Union. And this is where we talk about the dynamic pyramid model. So here we have a dynamic pyramid model. This is given by Zhang in 2024 in her book called High Wire: How China Regulates the Big Tech and Governs the Economy. And in this book, she talks about structure, process, and outcome. So she talks about hierarchy, volatility, and fragility. And importantly, from China's perspective, for China, there's a need to maintain authoritarian information control. The digital sector of China is responsible for about 40% of GDP, employing about 200 million people. So, hence, the big challenge for China here is how to maintain the competing interest of information control, political stability, and the need to boost AI development for economic growth and overcoming US tech rivalry. So, with all those perspectives in mind, let's have a look at this dynamic pyramid model from China's perspective. So in this model, as you can see here, we have hierarchy. Now, China has a very centralized hierarchical system because obviously it's a state-run. The state actually sets the national priorities and the national goals. So we have the leaders and the regulators in the top, and the firms and the participants are at the bottom of the pyramid, right? So the Chinese tech firms have no resistance. I mean, when it comes to making policies by the leaders and regulators, there's very little resistance from the Chinese tech firms in that particular space. Unlike the US, where the US tech firms will fight tooth and nail for making sure that there is no policy that can stifle AI innovation. So that's the reason where businesses form a very important part in the US. Whereas if you talk about China, it's actually the government forming a very important part, and not really the businesses or the consumers. And if you talk about the European Union, it's all about consumers. It's all about consumer rights protection. So we talk about these key stakeholders across the world regions. In China, it's the government. In the EU, it's the consumers, and then in the United States, is the firms and the businesses, right? So we have these very key stakeholders across the world regions that really dominate this AI regulation landscape. So coming back to this particular model, the dynamic pyramid model and the hierarchy, and using China as an example. So we have the leaders and regulators. They come up with the rules and regulations for regulating a particular sector, and that impacts the Chinese firms who have very little say in really the making of these policies. So there are lacks of checks and balances. There's a very inefficient information transmission, and this results in a lot of volatility in the market. Especially in terms of the cycles of regulatory easing and tightening, which results in volatility in the market. So there's a policy that comes from the leaders and regulators that impacts Chinese tech firms. This results in volatility and resulting further in fragility, which means that the businesses and the investors, they are risk averse. There's the private companies retreat. And then we have the state-run organizations or the state-run institutions benefit as a part of the entire dynamic. And just to give you an example, in December 2023 or 2023 in China, the gaming sector, came up with a lot of regulations. So there was a gaming regulator. He came up with a set of rules and regulations for regulating the gaming sector in China in December 2023. While the rules were not very strict, but the way the market reacted was really bad. And the market sentiments was so bad that about 100 billion US dollars were wiped from the market capitalizations of the Chinese tech firms like NetEase and Tencent. And because of that, there was a lot of, there was so much of volatility, there was so much problems in the market. As a result of that, the Chinese government and the regulators, they had to step in. So firstly, they sacked the gaming sector regulator. And then obviously there was a dramatic policy reversal that happened because the market sentiments became that bad. So as a result, this fragility impacted the hierarchy too. So this becomes like a vicious cycle. And that's why this particular dynamic pyramid model becomes very, very important from the point of explanation of AI policy regulation, especially from Chinese perspective. All right, going further here. So now let's look at how China is approaching the non-compliance in AI for AI technologies. So here, what I've given you in this picture here is you can see how different countries are actually looking at AI non-compliance and how are they fighting the individual businesses for non-compliance for AI regulation. So the Cyberspace Administration of China, the CAC, fined Didi, the company, the ride-hailing company, in 2022 for about $1.2 billion. And this was because they had violated the cybersecurity law, the data security law, and the personal information law. And as a result of that, there was a lot of unauthorized analysis of the passenger travel information. And because of that, China actually, had this $1.2 billion as penalties given to Didi. So that means China has been taking non-compliance in AI very seriously, just like other countries in the world. And looking at the European Union and how European Union is approaching AI non-compliance, again, they are looking at it from a very serious perspective as well. So the EU AI Act sets forward a three-tier structure for fines against infringements by the AI system operators. And again, this is based on the level of risk. So remember, I talked to you about the EU AI Act and how we have level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 4 happens to be the unacceptable or the prohibited risk. So the heftiest fines are actually imposed for violations related to the prohibited systems or the prohibited or the unacceptable risk, which could be as high as 35 million euros or 7% of the worldwide annual turnover for the preceding financial year, whichever is higher. So again, that's the huge penalty for the businesses if they're non-compliant for EU AI Act. And again, the lowest penalties for AI operators are for providing incorrect, incomplete, or misleading information. And that is again for the lower level of the risk that I showed you for the EU AI Act. And this could be as high as 7.5 million euros or 1% of the total worldwide annual turnover of the company, whichever happens to be higher. So again, EU has been approaching AI non-compliance very seriously, especially from the perspective of the consumers and protecting the consumer fairness, consumer rights, and so on. So EU is all about consumers. And here, let's talk about how US has been looking at approaching the non-compliance in AI tools. So until now, obviously things have changed, with this year. And we still don't have a federal AI regulation or a real executive order in place. But in 2022, Hello Digit, a fintech company in the US that promotes automated savings, was found to be violating the Consumer Financial Protection Act by the Consumer Financial Protection Board. And because of that, they were fined $2.7 million for using a faulty algorithm that caused overdrafts and penalties for its users, promising reimbursements if there were overdrafts, and deceiving customers by pocketing earned interest when they say they wouldn't. So obviously this company was fined at that time for $2.7 million. Obviously things have changed as of now. But having said that we don't still have a formal federal regulation in the US as of today, just an executive order, and people are still working on it. We do have state level legislations in the US which are very strong. So that is one very positive thing, especially from the US perspective, because we do have, states like Colorado. The Colorado AI Act happens to be very popular and very strict. Even we have Utah AI Act, which is very popular. There is Elvis in Tennessee. And Elvis basically means Ensuring Likeness, Voice, and Image Security Act. And this is for protecting the rights of, the artist, especially from the misuse and misinformation of AI. So again, we may not have a federal regulation for AI in the US, but we do have state level regulations in the US, which are very popular and which are very effective for the AI regulation space. Now, if I have to summarize this entire thing or what I just talked about for the US, China, and the European Union, so from the United States perspective, we have a pyramid which is market-driven innovation. So it's businesses who are the key stakeholders in this US AI policy governance. And here it's all about not stifling the innovation. It's all about making sure that the businesses are innovating in the space of AI. So it's market-driven innovation. We do have self-regulation by the industry with flexible government intervention. And there's a case-by-case enforcement. There are general ethical considerations, but less prescriptive governance compared to the EU. And obviously, it becomes a very bottom-heavy pyramid where businesses have a huge say in the US AI policy governance. So that's from the US perspective. If we're looking at the EU AI policy governance, it becomes a very balanced pyramid because here we have the consumers who are very important. So remember, the key stakeholders for the EU AI policy governance are the consumers. It's all about consumer rights, data protection, consumer privacy. We have stringent AI regulations in healthcare, law, and enforcement focus on human rights and ethics. So this is from the EU AI policy governance. And finally, if you're looking from a China's AI policy governance, you can see it's a very top-heavy pyramid because here we have the government or the state setting the national goals and priorities for AI. So here the government becomes a major key stakeholder for China, focusing on security, societal management, and economic leadership. Their ethical frameworks for social stability, AI's role in governance and public management, and hence everything is fostered at making or fostering AI innovation with the goal of making China as a global leader in AI development while aligning with the state priorities and the national goals and national priorities. So again, it's a very top-heavy pyramid. Government plays a very important role here. One of a very important point of discussion that we have, especially from China's perspective here, is we have a pro-growth faction in China versus a pro-regulation. So I talked to you about the CAC, or the Cyberspace Administration of China. They are the pro-regulation, so they are there to regulate everything, whether it's the recommendation algorithms or it's the deep fakes, or we're talking about the generative AI. The CAC, the Cyberspace Administration of China, plays a very important role. So this is all about pro-regulation. But then there's also pro-growth faction in China, which is actually by the 7 ministries in China that play a very important part, which includes Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and so on. And these ministries made sure that, whatever laws or rules or regulations are in place in China, they're also pro-growth. So for example, as I was telling you earlier, that within 6 months of ChatGPT born in the US, China came up with the draft measures for the generative AI services. Now, obviously, those measures that came up were actually by the CAC, and they were very strict. But when the 7 ministries look at that and they came up with a watered down version of the law, and just remember, we talked about imposing of the licensing regime for generative AI services. Now that became a watered down version, because what happened was initially the licensing regime was applicable to everything, but then they came up with a version where they said that if you're making a large language model in a lab and it's not impacting the general public, then it's not subjected to the licensing regime. So because of that loophole, now Microsoft sells Copilot AI services to Chinese companies, and there's no licensing regime needed. And again, the reason being, it's all about pro-growth in China, because that's helping Chinese companies to innovate in the space of AI. So that's where the pro-growth versus pro-regulation faction is very important from a Chinese perspective. Again, in China, we know that US has been doubling down in terms of imposing export restrictions for NVIDIA AI chips. All of those things are happening. We have seen this, the DeepSeek from China, which is the low cost, low energy efficient model. But all of this is happening, again, because of the pro-growth versus the pro-regulation faction in China. The last thing I'd like to talk to you about is paying for content. So again, I know I'm little running out of time, but one thing I'd say is that the US, the New York Times has been sued by OpenAI, Microsoft, and Perplexity for not paying for content. But now the US companies, even though there's no regulation in the space of AI needed, they are having the paying for content as a part of the business model. While in China, that's not the case. So even though there is a regulation in China, the companies are not paying for content, whereas in US, we are paying for content as a part of our business model. So that's all from my end. Thanks for listening. I know I've overshot my time. I'm sorry about that. But I just want to give you a comprehensive picture of the AI landscape. So over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anshu. I really appreciate the overview. It's, of course, a hot burning issue. We are running out of time, but if we had time, I would ask you the question, which I don't expect you to answer. Is there a chance for a universal regime at some point that would transcend these 3 blocks?
I'll just answer this question in one quick minute, John.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
we're
go
having
ahead.
this AI summit. It's such a popular question. We're having this
Yes.
AI summit in Paris right now, where the world leaders
No,
are
it's
there.
over. Yeah, it just
Yeah,
ended. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And there, if you see, US and UK are the only countries which have not gone for that comprehensive AI regulation, which other
that's
parts
right.
of the world are actually trying to talk to. So
Yeah.
to answer your question, it is something that can happen in the future, hopefully, but as of now, it doesn't seem the case to be.
Thank you very much. I think we are reluctantly going to let you go.